In a single century of Stuart rule, England fought 2 civil wars, executed a reigning monarch, abolished the monarchy, established a military republic, restored the monarchy, survived the worst plague in 200 years, watched its capital city burn to the ground, and then removed a second king in a revolution so precisely managed it required almost no bloodshed at all. To put that in perspective, France, a country famous for revolution, took 3 full centuries to accomplish roughly the same transformation. The Stuarts did it in 111 years between 1603 and 1714, while simultaneously founding colonies in the Americas, fighting 3 wars against the Dutch, and producing some of the greatest literature and architecture in English history. 4 monarchs sat on the throne. All 4 faced existential challenges to their power. 2 were deposed, 1 was beheaded, and only 1 died peacefully in her bed. Yet somehow, at the end of it all, Britain emerged with a constitutional monarchy, a sovereign parliament, a tradition of religious tolerance, and an empire stretching across 3 continents. The Stuarts did not plan any of this. They resisted most of it, but the chaos they created and failed to control laid the foundations of the modern world. This is their story. Before they ever sat upon the English throne, before they became synonymous with civil war and revolution, the Stuarts were simply the Stewards of Scotland. Their story begins not in the gilded halls of Westminster, but in the rugged, wind-scoured kingdom to the north, where loyalty and survival were often the same thing. The name itself tells the tale. The family descended from a line of hereditary High Stewards of Scotland, royal administrators who managed the crown's estates and households across generations. Over time, the title became a surname. Steward softened and shifted through French influence to Stuart, and a dynasty was born from a job title. That dynasty officially claimed the Scottish crown in 1371 when Robert II became the first Stuart king. He was already 54 years old at his coronation, the grandson of the great Robert the Bruce through his mother, Marjorie. His path to kingship had been long and often frustrating. But once the Stuarts took the crown, they would not relinquish it for over 3 centuries. What followed, however, was rarely peaceful. The early Stuart kings of Scotland seemed almost magnetically drawn to catastrophe. James I was assassinated by a group of nobles in 1437. James III was killed following the Battle of Sauchiburn in 1488, apparently by an unknown assailant after fleeing the field. James IV died at the catastrophic defeat of Flodden in 1513, leading his army personally into an English slaughter. The pattern was so consistent it bordered on the remarkable. The Stuarts were brave, often gifted, occasionally brilliant rulers, but Scotland was a kingdom where a king needed to be all of those things and also extraordinarily lucky. Then came Mary. Mary, Queen of Scots, brought the Stuart story an entirely new dimension when her father, James V, died in 1542, just days after her birth, leaving Scotland in the hands of an infant girl. From the moment she could be used as a diplomatic instrument, European powers took notice. At age 5, she was betrothed to the French Dauphin, and by 1558 she had married Francis, briefly becoming Queen of France as well as Scotland. The Stuarts had stepped onto the continental stage. But Francis died young in 1560, and Mary returned to Scotland in 1561, a Catholic queen arriving in an increasingly Protestant kingdom. The years that followed were electric with tension, scandal, and tragedy. By 1567, Following the murder of her husband Lord Darnley and her deeply controversial marriage to the Earl of Bothwell, Mary had been forced to abdicate her throne. Her infant son, James VI of Scotland, was crowned in her place. A dynasty forged in medieval Scotland now stood at an extraordinary crossroads, with one eye on its turbulent past and the other, perhaps unconsciously, drifting southward. By 1587, the woman who had been forced from her Scottish throne 2 decades earlier finally exhausted the patience of the cousin who had sheltered her. Elizabeth I of England had kept Mary, Queen of Scots, imprisoned for nearly 19 years, a living problem she could neither solve nor ignore. When evidence emerged that Mary had consented to a plot against Elizabeth's life, the decision could no longer be deferred. On February 8, 1587, Mary was beheaded at Fotheringhay Castle. It took 3 strokes of the axe. The execution sent shockwaves across Catholic Europe and solved one problem while quietly creating another. With Mary gone, the question of who would follow Elizabeth onto the English throne grew louder with each passing year. Elizabeth, of course, had made that question her most carefully guarded weapon. For decades, the Virgin Queen had wielded the possibility of marriage and succession like a diplomatic instrument, dangling the prospect before foreign princes and domestic suitors alike, committing to nothing. It was brilliant political theater. But England was a kingdom, not a performance. The Queen was aging. She had no children, and she refused, with remarkable consistency, to name her successor. Why? Partly temperament, partly hard calculation. Elizabeth understood that a named heir became a rival, a focal point for those impatient with the present regime. She had seen what it meant to be the waiting successor in her own precarious years before ascending the throne. She would not create another such figure. And so England waited, increasingly anxious, as the Queen moved through her 60s. The tension was not merely ceremonial. A disputed succession could mean civil war, foreign invasion, or both. Into this uncertainty stepped a small, meticulous man with a talent for patience. Robert Cecil, the Queen's principal secretary and son of the great Lord Burghley, began a secret correspondence with James VI of Scotland sometime around 1600. The letters were coded. The couriers were trusted. The entire exchange was conducted without Elizabeth's knowledge. Cecil was not acting out of treachery, but out of pragmatism. James had the strongest dynastic claim, being the great-great-grandson of Henry VII through his grandmother Margaret Tudor. He was Protestant. He was already an experienced king. Cecil was simply ensuring that when the moment arrived, England would not stumble. James, for his part, understood the game perfectly. He wrote with careful restraint, neither pushing too hard nor appearing indifferent. He wanted the crown of England more than almost anything, and he was wise enough not to say so too plainly. On March 24th, 1603, Elizabeth I died at Richmond Palace, having reportedly gestured toward a figure of James when pressed, one last time, to name her heir. Cecil's messengers were already riding north before she drew her final breath. The Stuart Dynasty was coming to England, and it was arriving by invitation. The rider who carried the news of Elizabeth's death covered the 400 miles between London and Edinburgh in less than 60 hours. When James VI of Scotland received word on the morning of March 25th, 1603, he was already prepared. The letters with Cecil had seen to that. What followed was one of the most extraordinary journeys in British history. James rode south not as a conqueror but as an heir, and England received him accordingly. Crowds gathered in every town along the route, cheering a king they had never seen, projecting onto this 40-year-old Scotsman every hope that decades of succession anxiety had accumulated. James, for his part, was overwhelmed and delighted. He had ruled Scotland since infancy, often in poverty and frequent danger, surrounded by fractious nobles and Presbyterian ministers who treated their king as a convenient inconvenience. England, by contrast, seemed impossibly rich, impossibly welcoming. He arrived in London in May, and the city embraced him. But the honeymoon carried a warning embedded within it. The English were not simply celebrating a new king. They were celebrating the end of uncertainty. Their affection was real, but it was also conditional, wrapped around expectations James did not yet understand. His great ambition, announced almost immediately, was nothing less than the creation of a new nation. James envisioned a unified kingdom of Great Britain, England, and Scotland merged into a single state under a single crown. It was a genuinely remarkable idea, centuries ahead of its eventual realization. He pressed Parliament to adopt the title, to unify the legal systems, to treat his Scottish subjects as English citizens. Parliament refused. The English, it turned out, were rather attached to being English. They had cheered a Scottish king's arrival without intending to become anything other than what they already were. The proposal for full union stalled, then died, leaving James with a personal union of two crowns but two stubbornly separate kingdoms. It was the first indication that the English Parliament would not simply follow where their new monarch pointed. A second, more lasting achievement emerged from the conference James convened at Hampton Court in January of 1604. Called to address concerns from Puritan clergy about the state of the English Church, the conference produced surprisingly little reform. But one proposal, almost a footnote at the time, would echo across 4 centuries. A scholar named John Reynolds suggested a new translation of the Bible, authoritative and accessible. James embraced the idea with genuine enthusiasm. The result, completed in 1611 after 7 years of work by 47 scholars, was the King James Bible. Its cadences would shape the English language itself, embedding phrases into the daily speech of millions of people who would never know their origin. Whatever failures attended James's reign, this single achievement endures as one of the most consequential acts of cultural patronage in the history of the English-speaking world. But that triumph lay ahead. In the immediate years after his accession, James was already discovering the particular difficulty of governing England. The Parliament he inherited was assertive, legally minded, and deeply suspicious of royal overreach. James believed, with complete sincerity, in the divine right of kings. Parliament believed, with equal sincerity, in the ancient rights of Englishmen. These two convictions could not easily share the same room. The tensions of those early years were not yet catastrophic. They were more like the first tremors before an earthquake, easy to dismiss, possible to manage, but pointing unmistakably towards something larger gathering beneath the surface. Beneath the surface of James's new kingdom, another kind of pressure was building, and it had been building for decades. English Catholics had endured more than 40 years of systematic exclusion by the time James arrived from Scotland. They could not hold public office. They could not attend university. They faced heavy fines simply for refusing to attend Protestant church services. Many had hoped that James, whose wife Anne of Denmark had converted to Catholicism, might bring relief. Those hopes evaporated quickly. James had no intention of antagonizing his Protestant establishment, and the recusancy fines continued. For most Catholics, suffering meant endurance. But for a small circle of men gathered around a charismatic Midlands gentleman named Robert Catesby, it meant something else entirely. Catesby was not a man easily ignored. Tall, physically imposing, and possessed of a burning personal conviction, he had a gift for drawing men into his orbit and bending them to his purposes. By the winter of 1604, he had assembled a corps of conspirators who shared his conclusion that negotiation and patience had failed. If Protestant rule could not be reformed, it would have to be destroyed. The plan they devised was staggering in its audacity. They would pack the cellars beneath the House of Lords with gunpowder. When Parliament assembled on November 5th of 1605, with the king present for the state opening, the explosion would kill James, his ministers, and the leadership of the English state in a single moment. Into the vacuum, the conspirators intended to sweep a Catholic uprising, seize power, and place a Catholic monarch on the throne. They recruited a soldier named Guy Fawkes, a Yorkshireman with military experience gained fighting for Catholic Spain in the Netherlands. His job was simple, practical, and lethal: to light the fuse. Over the following months, the conspirators acquired 36 barrels of gunpowder and concealed them beneath Parliament. That quantity, experts would later calculate, was more than sufficient to obliterate the building and much of the surrounding area. The plan moved forward through the spring and summer, its secret held among 13 men. But 13 men cannot keep a secret forever. In late October, an anonymous letter reached a Catholic nobleman warning him to stay away from Parliament on November 5th. The letter found its way to the King's Council. On the night of November 4th, in the early hours before dawn, a search party descended into the cellars and found Fawkes standing among the barrels, a lantern in his hand. The interrogations that followed were brutal even by the standards of the age. Fawkes endured torture before providing names. The other conspirators fled north, gathered for a final desperate stand in Staffordshire, and were killed or captured within days. Catesby died in the siege, shot through, according to some accounts, with the same bullet that killed his closest friend. The executions that January were deliberately savage. The plotters were hanged, drawn, and quartered in public, their suffering intended as spectacle and warning. Parliament responded with new legislation tightening restrictions on Catholic life, removing them still further from public participation in English society. The wounds cut deep and would not fully heal for more than 2 centuries. Yet the strangest legacy of the Gunpowder Plot was not legal but cultural. Every year, on the 5th of November, bonfires are lit across Britain. An effigy burns. Children recite a verse that is more than 400 years old. The memory of one night in a cellar beneath Westminster has outlasted nearly every other event of the Stuart age. What the plotters intended as a beginning became instead an ending. And in the years that followed, the fault lines within the Stuart kingdom would shift from religion towards something equally dangerous: the question of who ultimately held power in England. The question of power was one James Stuart had very definite views about, and he was never shy in expressing them. James believed, with genuine intellectual conviction, that kings ruled by divine appointment. God had placed them on their thrones. To challenge a monarch was therefore not merely treason but blasphemy. He wrote as much in his own published works, including a treatise called The True Law of Free Monarchies, composed before he ever set foot in England. The theology was sincere. The politics were disastrous. Parliament saw things differently. England's landed classes and merchant interests had spent generations accumulating rights, customs, and expectations about their role in governance. When James lectured his assembled parliament about the sacred nature of royal prerogative, members listened in stony silence. When he dismissed their grievances as irrelevant to his God-given authority, they quietly reached for the one instrument they actually controlled: the nation's purse strings. Money was the reef upon which James's reign repeatedly ran aground. The crown's finances were precarious when he inherited them, and James's personal extravagance made them catastrophically worse. He was generous to a fault with gifts, pensions, and grants to those he favored. By 1610, royal debts had become a genuine crisis. His chief minister, Robert Cecil, proposed a grand bargain with Parliament called the Great Contract, exchanging certain royal rights for a guaranteed annual income. It collapsed when neither side trusted the other enough to commit. The mistrust was only deepened by the company James chose to keep. Courts had always operated on favoritism, but James's attachments attracted particular attention. His deep affection for handsome young men was remarked upon across Europe. Robert Carr, a young Scotsman who first caught the king's eye after falling from his horse at a tournament, rose with astonishing speed to become Earl of Somerset and the most powerful figure at court. His fall was equally spectacular. In 1615, Carr and his wife were implicated in the poisoning of a courtier named Thomas Overbury, who had inconveniently opposed their marriage. Both were tried and convicted. Into the space Carr vacated stepped a figure of considerably greater consequence. George Villiers was 23 years old, extraordinarily handsome, and possessed of an effortless charm that captivated the king completely. He rose faster than any favorite before him, accumulating titles until he stood as Duke of Buckingham, the first non-royal duke created in living memory. Unlike Carr, Buckingham was not merely decorative. He was energetic, ambitious, and soon deeply embedded in the machinery of government itself. Buckingham's influence stretched into foreign policy, which was already troubled enough. James had built his reign partly on the genuine achievement of ending England's long war with Spain, and he nursed romantic ambitions of a grand European peace cemented by marriage. The proposed union of Prince Charles with the Spanish Infanta dragged on for years, dangling the prospect of a vast Catholic dowry while Spanish diplomats extracted religious concessions from an increasingly desperate English court. In 1623, Buckingham and Charles took the extraordinary step of traveling incognito to Madrid to press the match in person. The adventure was farcical and the Spanish reception frigid. They returned empty-handed, and the English public, deeply suspicious of Catholic Spain, greeted their failure with bonfires of celebration. James would not live to see what came next. He died in March of 1625, aged 58, worn down by illness and the accumulated frustrations of a reign that had promised more than it delivered. A king of genuine intelligence and learning, he had never quite understood the country he governed. His son was waiting, and Charles Stuart's understanding would prove still more fatally incomplete. Charles Stuart was 24 years old when he became King of England in March of 1625. Where his father had been garrulous, opinionated, and almost compulsively talkative, Charles was quiet, composed, and guarded. He spoke with a slight stammer that made public occasions painful, and he retreated behind a formal dignity that many interpreted as coldness. He was not cold. He was simply a man who had built high walls around himself and called them principles. Those principles were the key to everything that followed. Charles believed, as James had believed, in the divine right of kings. But where James had been willing to argue, cajole, and negotiate, Charles saw compromise as something close to sin. To yield on a matter of royal prerogative was not pragmatism. It was betrayal of God's own order. This inflexibility, so admirable in a man of faith, was catastrophic in a constitutional monarch. His first act as king was to marry. The bride was Henrietta Maria, the 15-year-old daughter of Henri IV of France, and the marriage was arranged with diplomatic speed. The English Parliament and public greeted the match with deep unease. France was Catholic. Henrietta Maria was visibly, devoutly Catholic, and the marriage treaty contained private concessions allowing her to practice her faith and raise any children in her own religion, at least initially. Rumors spread and darkened in the telling. To a Protestant nation still haunted by memories of the Spanish Armada and the Gunpowder Plot, a Catholic queen felt like an open wound. The marriage was rocky at first. The young queen arrived with a vast retinue of French attendants who scandalized the English court, and Charles eventually sent most of them home in exasperation. Gradually, though, something unexpected happened. The two grew genuinely close. Henrietta Maria became his greatest comfort and, in the eyes of many Englishmen, his most dangerous advisor. Buckingham remained. James's dazzling favorite had survived the transition between reigns and continued to dominate foreign policy with disastrous results. 2 military expeditions under his direction, one to Cadiz in 1625 and another to the Isle de Ré in 1627, both ended in humiliating failure. Parliament was furious, and Buckingham became the focus of all its anger. When Parliament moved to impeach him, Charles simply dissolved it. He would not sacrifice his friend. That protection cost him dearly. By 1628, Parliament had had enough. Before granting Charles a single penny in taxation, members forced through a document that would echo across centuries, the Petition of Right. It was direct and devastating in its simplicity. The king could not imprison subjects without cause. He could not levy taxes without parliamentary consent. Soldiers could not be billeted in private homes without permission. Martial law could not be imposed in peacetime. Charles signed it because he desperately needed the money. Whether he ever intended to honor it was another question entirely. Buckingham never saw what came next. In August of 1628, a disgruntled naval officer named John Felton stabbed him to death in a Portsmouth lodging house. The public celebrated openly. Charles wept in private. grief did not soften him. If anything, it hardened his conviction that Parliament was his enemy, that accommodation was weakness, and that God would ultimately vindicate a king who stood firm. He was about to test that conviction in ways that would shake England to its foundations. On the 2nd of March, 1629, the final session of Charles's Third Parliament descended into something England had rarely witnessed. When the Speaker of the House attempted to adjourn the chamber on royal command, members physically held him down in his chair. By parliamentary convention, a sitting speaker meant a sitting parliament, and they intended to use every remaining minute. 3 resolutions were passed by acclamation, declaring anyone who introduced Catholic innovations into the church or advised the collection of unauthorized taxes to be a traitor to the kingdom. Then the doors were opened. The Parliament of Charles I was finished. For the next 11 years, he never called another. His supporters called what followed the personal rule. His enemies called it the 11 Years' Tyranny. Both names captured something true. Without parliamentary taxation, Charles needed money, and he found it through methods that ranged from the creative to the constitutionally alarming. Ship money was the most notorious of these. Traditionally, coastal towns and counties had been required to fund naval vessels in times of war. Charles extended this levy to inland counties in peacetime, collecting it year after year as though it were ordinary taxation. Technically, he may have had legal grounds. Practically, everyone understood what was happening. The Crown was funding itself without Parliament's consent, using ancient emergency powers as though the emergency never ended. The scheme worked, after a fashion. Revenue flowed in, the navy was maintained, and Charles actually governed with a degree of administrative competence that surprised people who expected chaos. But resentment accumulated quietly, in the manner of debts not yet called in. Religion made everything worse. Charles had appointed William Laud as Archbishop of Canterbury in 1633, and Laud approached the Church of England with the zeal of a man who believed beauty and order in worship were inseparable from true faith. Altar rails were installed in churches, separating clergy from congregation. Elaborate ceremonies were encouraged. The theology of grace that many Puritans held dear was sidelined in favor of something that looked, to hostile eyes, disturbingly close to Rome. Laud enforced conformity through the Court of High Commission with a relentlessness that made enemies everywhere. Clergymen who resisted were removed. Pamphlets criticizing his reforms were met with savage punishments, ears cropped, faces branded. In 1637, the lawyer William Prynne had his ears cut off for the second time, the stumps from his first punishment not having satisfied the court's appetite for deterrence. These were not the actions of a government confident in its own legitimacy. They were the actions of a government that had confused obedience with consent and silence with approval. England was not silent. It was waiting. And it was in Scotland, not England, where that waiting finally ended. The spark that would set the Stuart world alight was already being struck, in a country Charles understood far less than he imagined. Scotland had always been a different country, even under the same crown. Its church, the Kirk, had been built on Calvinist foundations that its people regarded not as mere preference, but as sacred covenant with God himself. When Charles I decided to bring Scottish worship into conformity with English practice, he was not adjusting an administrative arrangement. He was reaching into something his northern subjects considered inviolable. He did not ask them. He simply acted. In the summer of 1637, a new prayer book arrived in Scottish churches, imposed by royal decree without consultation with the General Assembly of the Kirk or the Scottish Parliament. On the 23rd of July at St. Giles Cathedral in Edinburgh, the dean rose to read from it for the first time. What happened next became legend. A market trader named Jenny Geddes, or so the story goes, hurled her wooden stool at his head. Whatever the precise truth, the congregation erupted. Stools, stones, and shouts of "Popery" filled the air. The dean was chased from the pulpit. The Bishop of Edinburgh barely escaped with his life. The riot at St. Giles was not an isolated outburst. It was the visible tip of a fury that had been building for years. Within months, Scottish nobles, clergy, lawyers, and common people gathered to sign a document that would shake the Stuart throne to its foundations. The National Covenant of February 1638 was a declaration of collective resistance, framed in the language of ancient Scottish liberties and Protestant faith. Tens of thousands signed it across the country, some said in their own blood. Those who signed became covenanters, bound together by something that felt, to them, more binding than loyalty to any king. Charles faced a choice between compromise and confrontation. He chose confrontation. The result was the Bishops' Wars, two humiliating military engagements that exposed just how fragile the personal rule really was. In the First Bishops' War of 1639, Charles marched an army north that was underfunded, under-equipped, and deeply reluctant to fight. The Scots, by contrast, had experienced soldiers recently returned from the 30 Years' War in Europe and a cause they believed in completely. The two armies faced each other at Berwick, and Charles, realizing the contest was already lost, negotiated the pacification of Berwick rather than risk a battle he could not win. It settled nothing. Within a year, the Second Bishops' War began, and this time the Scots did not wait. They crossed the border and occupied the northern English counties of Northumberland and Durham, demanding payment of £40,000 every day until a permanent settlement was reached. England's king was being occupied by Scotland's army, and the humiliation was total. To raise the money to fight the Scots, Charles needed Parliament. In April 1640, he summoned one for the first time in 11 years. The short Parliament lasted barely 3 weeks. Members arrived not to grant supply, but to air 11 years of accumulated grievances, and when it became clear they would not simply vote Charles the funds he needed, he dissolved them in a fury. But the Scots were still in England, and the bills were still unpaid. In November 1640, Charles summoned Parliament again. This Parliament would not be so easy to dismiss. It would sit, in one form or another, for the next 20 years. And the men who assembled at Westminster that autumn understood that something fundamental was now at stake. The dominoes were falling. There was no longer any question of whether England would face a reckoning with its king. The only question was what form that reckoning would take. The Parliament that assembled in November 1640 was unlike any Charles had faced before. Its members had grievances sharpened by a decade of frustration, and they arrived at Westminster with something more dangerous than anger. They arrived with purpose. Their first target was the man who had made the personal rule possible. Thomas Wentworth, the Earl of Strafford, had served Charles as chief minister and enforcer, governing Ireland with an iron hand and urging his king to use the Irish army against the Scottish rebels. To Parliament, Strafford was the living symbol of royal tyranny. They moved against him immediately, charging him with high treason. The trial, which began in March 1641, gripped the nation. Strafford was a formidable defendant, methodical and composed, dismantling the prosecution's case point by point. It became clear he could not be convicted under the strict legal definition of treason. Parliament's response was to abandon the trial entirely and pass a bill of attainder instead, a legislative declaration of guilt requiring no verdict from a court. It needed only the king's signature. Charles had promised Strafford his protection. But crowds surrounded Whitehall. Bishops reported their windows smashed. The Queen was said to be in tears. On the 12th of May 1641, Charles signed the warrant. Strafford was beheaded on Tower Hill before a crowd estimated at tens of thousands. Charles would later call it the most wicked thing he had ever done. Whether or not Parliament trusted his word before that moment, they certainly could not trust it afterwards. The tension cracked open further in October 1641 when news arrived from Ireland. The Catholic Irish had risen in rebellion, and the initial reports that reached London were catastrophic in their detail, describing massacres of Protestant settlers, entire communities put to the sword. The true death toll, though terrible, was inflated beyond recognition by the time the pamphlets reached English streets. The question of who would command an army to suppress the rebellion became immediately explosive. Parliament refused to place such a force under royal control. Charles, they feared, might turn it against them. It was against this backdrop that John Pym, Parliament's most skilled political operator, pushed forward the Grand Remonstrance, a document cataloging every grievance against the crown since the beginning of the reign. It was less a petition than a public accusation, designed to be printed and distributed directly to the English people. After a debate that stretched past midnight on the 22nd of November, it passed by 11 votes. 11 votes out of more than 300 members present. England's political nation was splitting almost exactly in half. Charles responded in the most catastrophic way imaginable. On the 4th of January 1642, he arrived at the House of Commons in person, leading 400 soldiers to arrest 5 members of Parliament he accused of treasonous contact with the Scottish enemy. It was an act without precedent, a direct assault on parliamentary privilege that every member of the House, whether they had supported the remonstrance or opposed it, could recognize as an existential threat to their institution. But someone had warned the 5 members. When Charles entered the chamber and looked towards their seats, they were empty. He asked the Speaker, William Lenthal, where they had gone. Lenthal's reply became one of the most celebrated sentences in English constitutional history. He had neither eyes to see nor tongue to speak, he said, except as the House directed. Charles left to jeers and cries of privilege. He never entered the Commons again. Within days, he had left London, which no longer felt safe. Parliament began organizing its own military forces. By summer, both sides were raising armies. On the 22nd of August 1642, at Nottingham, Charles raised the royal standard, the ancient signal that a king was calling his subjects to war. A storm that evening blew it down. It was perhaps the most honest symbol England had produced in years. The war that followed would cost more than 80,000 English lives, and at the end of it, the king himself would lose his head. The first shots of the English Civil War were fired not in anger but in confusion. On the 23rd of October 1642, at Edgehill in Warwickshire, 2 armies that had never fought a battle faced each other across a sloping field in the autumn cold. Neither side quite knew what it was doing. Neither side, it turned out, was capable of finishing the job. The king's cavalry, commanded by his nephew Prince Rupert of the Rhine, performed brilliantly in the opening moments, scattering Parliament's horsemen from the field. Then Rupert made the mistake that would define royalist generalship for years to come. He pursued them. While his cavalry vanished into the distance, the parliamentary infantry in the center held firm. When Rupert's horse finally returned, the moment had passed. The battle ended as darkness fell, with roughly 1,500 dead on each side and nothing decided. Both armies spent the night among their own wounded and their own dead, and in the morning, they looked at each other and went home. The geography of the war reflected the deepest fault lines in English society. The north and west of England, more rural and more traditional, tended toward the king. The south and east, with their prosperous wool towns, their Puritan congregations, and above all London itself, with its population of 400,000 and its unmatched wealth, tended toward Parliament. The Navy went to Parliament almost immediately, which meant the coasts were largely closed to royalist supply. The City of London's money funded parliamentary armies when the king's treasury ran dry. But allegiance was rarely so clean. Families divided. The Verney family sent one son to fight for Charles and another against him. Communities that straddled the regional boundaries found themselves raided by both sides. Some men changed coats more than once, following conscience, opportunity, or simply survival. This was not a war of two nations cleanly separated. It was a war fought in the same villages, across the same fields, sometimes within the same households. By 1643, the king held much of the country and Parliament's position was genuinely precarious. What saved Parliament was a diplomatic stroke of remarkable consequence. John Pym, dying of cancer and aware he had little time left, negotiated the Solemn League and Covenant with the Scottish Covenanters in September of that year. Scotland would send an army south to fight for Parliament. In return, Parliament promised to reform the Church of England along Presbyterian lines. It was a promise Parliament's more independent-minded members had no intention of keeping. But it brought 21,000 Scottish soldiers across the border, and that changed everything. The transformation announced itself at Marston Moor, near York, on the 2nd of July 1644. Parliamentary and Scottish forces combined to face a royalist army under Prince Rupert. The battle, the largest ever fought on English soil, turned in the gathering dusk. On Parliament's left flank, a cavalry commander named Oliver Cromwell led his horsemen in a disciplined charge that shattered the royalist right. Then, crucially, wheeled his men back into the battle rather than giving chase. It was precisely the discipline that Rupert had failed to provide 2 years earlier at Edgehill. Cromwell's troopers swept through the royalist center from behind. By nightfall, 4,000 royalist soldiers were dead and the north of England was lost to the king forever. Cromwell, a Huntingdonshire gentleman who had been a relatively minor figure at the war's beginning, emerged from Marston Moor as Parliament's most dangerous soldier. The war had found its decisive man. Now, Parliament would have to decide what to do with him. The problem Parliament faced going into 1645 was not a shortage of soldiers. It was a shortage of soldiers who would fight. The armies raised by regional commanders, men like the Earl of Manchester and the Earl of Essex, had become attached to local concerns, reluctant to campaign far from their home counties, and led by commanders who were, in Cromwell's blunt assessment, unwilling to win. In a moment of barely concealed fury, Cromwell told Parliament that Manchester seemed always to be afraid lest the king should be beaten. The solution was the self-denying ordinance passed in the spring of 1645. Its logic was elegant and ruthless. No member of Parliament could hold a military command. At a stroke, the aristocratic generals who had been managing the war cautiously, carefully, as if too decisive a victory might upset the social order, were removed from the field. In their place rose a new institution, the new model army, 22,000 men paid regularly, trained uniformly, and drawn from wherever talent existed rather than from the accident of birth. Sir Thomas Fairfax, 33 years old and one of the few commanders who had demonstrated consistent competence, became its general. Oliver Cromwell, whose seat in Parliament technically disqualified him, received a special exemption. Some things were too useful to sacrifice to principle. What made the new model army different was not just its discipline, but its spirit. Its ranks filled with men who believed they were fighting for something larger than a county or a paycheck. Puritan conviction ran through it like iron through stone. These were soldiers who sang psalms before battle and debated theology in camp. Their officers were promoted for ability. A butcher's son could command a regiment if he was good enough. It was, for its time, a genuinely revolutionary institution. The test came on the 14th of June 1645, at a gentle ridge near the village of Naseby in Northamptonshire. Charles had roughly 7,500 men. Fairfax and Cromwell had perhaps 14,000. The king's army had no business fighting at all that day, but Prince Rupert pressed for it, and Charles, as he so often did, deferred to the most confident voice in the room. The battle lasted less than 2 hours. Rupert's cavalry swept away Parliament's left flank, then rode on, chasing broken men from the field. It was Edgehill again, and Marston Moor again. On the other flank, Cromwell's horsemen drove the Royalists back, then wheeled. The new model army's infantry held the center. When Cromwell's horse crashed into the exposed Royalist flank, the king's army simply came apart. In the abandoned Royalist baggage train, parliamentary soldiers found something more valuable than cannon or supplies. They found the king's private correspondence, his most intimate letters, including communications that revealed he had been negotiating with Irish Catholic forces and seeking military aid from France. Parliament published them immediately under the title "The King's Cabinet Opened." The effect was devastating. Whatever lingering sympathy existed for Charles among moderate Englishmen began to curdle. The king spent the remaining months of 1645 watching his remaining strongholds fall one by one. Bristol, Oxford, Chester. By the spring of 1646, he had nowhere left to turn. On the 5th of May, Charles slipped out of Oxford in disguise and rode north, surrendering himself to the Scottish army camped at Newark. He believed, perhaps reasonably, that the Scots would prove more sympathetic than his English enemies. He was wrong about that too. The Scots would hold him for 9 months, negotiate their own payment from Parliament, and hand him over. The First Civil War was over, but no one yet knew what came next, because no one, least of all Charles himself, had ever imagined a war might end without a king still standing at the center of things. What does a nation do with a king it cannot trust, cannot defeat in negotiation, and cannot simply ignore? By 1647, Parliament was discovering there was no good answer. Charles had surrendered his body, but never his will. While held first by the Scots, then by Parliament's own forces, he spent every month scheming. He played his captors against each other with considerable skill, negotiating simultaneously with English Presbyterians, Scottish Covenanters, and Irish Confederates. He signed a secret treaty with the Scots in December 1647, promising to establish Presbyterian church governance in England in exchange for a Scottish army marching on his behalf. He called it the engagement. His opponents called it what it was: treachery. The result was the Second Civil War, erupting in the spring of 1648. Royalist risings broke out in Wales, in Kent, in Essex. A Scottish army crossed the border in July. It was, compared to the First War, a ragged and desperate affair. Cromwell and Fairfax suppressed it with efficient brutality. At Preston in August, Cromwell destroyed the Scottish force in 3 days of hard fighting. By the end of the summer, the Second War was over. But something had changed in the men who won it. The officers of the New Model Army had watched thousands more men die because Charles, having lost one war, had simply recruited another. In a document called the Remonstrance of the Army, they reached a conclusion that would have seemed impossible just 3 years earlier. The king must be tried as a criminal. Parliament's Presbyterian majority recoiled. They were still negotiating with Charles, still hoping for a settlement. On the 1st of December 1648, army soldiers intercepted the king at Newport and took him into custody. 6 days later, Colonel Thomas Pride stood at the doors of the House of Commons with a list of names. Roughly 45 members were arrested. Around 90 more were turned away. What remained, perhaps 60 members willing to proceed, became known as the Rump Parliament. It voted to put the king on trial. No European monarch had ever faced such a proceeding. There was no precedent, no legal framework, no established court. Parliament simply created one, the High Court of Justice, assembled from commissioners willing to serve. Many refused. Of the 135 named, barely 68 showed up with any consistency. On the 20th of January 1649, Charles Stewart was brought into Westminster Hall. The building was vast and cold, packed with spectators. Charges were read accusing him of treason against his own people, of making war upon his own nation for the advancement of personal tyranny. Charles refused to remove his hat. He looked around the court with an expression observers noted as something close to contempt. When asked to enter a plea, he challenged the court's legitimacy instead. By what authority could subjects try their sovereign? The question was not merely legal strategy. Charles genuinely believed, with complete sincerity, that his authority came from God and could not be judged by men. He made this argument on the second day, and the third, and every day the trial continued. It was, in its strange way, his finest performance. Denied the ability to mount a defense, he turned his refusal into a statement. Many who had wanted him convicted found themselves unsettled by his composure. It made no difference. On the 27th of January, the court found him guilty of treason. The death warrant, when it was drawn up, required signatures from the commissioners. 59 men signed. Some pressed forward eagerly. Others signed reluctantly or were pressured by colleagues. A few would later claim their hands had been guided by force. On the 30th of January 1649, Charles I walked through a window of the banqueting house in Whitehall onto a scaffold draped in black. He spoke briefly, calmly, forgiving his executioners. Then he laid his head on the block. A single blow. The crowd made a sound witnesses struggled to describe, something between a groan and a collective exhalation, as if England itself had not quite believed it would come to this. The question now was what came next, because a nation that had just executed its king had to decide, urgently, what it intended to become. The morning of January the 30th, 1649, was bitterly cold. Charles rose early, dressed with unusual care, and asked for an extra shirt. He did not want to shiver in front of the crowd. He would not give them the satisfaction of mistaking cold for fear. He had slept, reportedly, with the soundness of a man who had made his peace. A bishop attended him through those final hours. Charles received communion, prayed, and ate a small amount of bread. He was 50 years old, and he moved through his last morning with the deliberate calm of a man who had decided exactly what his death would mean. What followed was a short walk that crossed a continent of history. Through the interior of the banqueting house he passed, beneath the great ceiling canvases painted by Rubens, commissioned by his own father James, glorifying the wisdom of Stuart kingship, then out through a window specially cut in the wall, onto the scaffold erected in the street below. Black cloth draped the platform. A crowd had gathered in the January cold, held back by ranks of soldiers. Charles spoke. His voice did not carry far enough for most of the crowd to hear, so he addressed himself mainly to the small group of officials and clergy standing nearby. His words were recorded. He declared himself an innocent man, dying in the defense of the liberties of the people, even though the people had not been permitted to judge him. He called himself a martyr. He forgave those responsible for his death. He affirmed his belief in the Church of England. Then he tucked his hair beneath a white cap, lay down, and positioned his neck on the low block. He stretched out his hands as a signal. The axe fell once. A single clean stroke. The sound that rose from the crowd defied easy description. Witnesses reached for different words. A groan. A universal groan, several accounts agreed, unlike anything they had heard before, a noise that seemed involuntary, wrung from thousands of people simultaneously. Some fainted. Some wept without fully understanding why. Even those who had despised Charles, who had fought 2 wars against him, found themselves shaken. Whatever they had expected to feel, this was not quite it. The shockwave moved outward from Whitehall with extraordinary speed. Across Europe, the reaction was visceral and immediate. Catholic courts were horrified. Protestant ones were nearly as appalled. The execution violated every assumption about the sanctity of crowned heads that undergirded the entire European order. In France, the court preacher Jacques-Benin Bossuet delivered a sermon calling the act monstrous. The exiled Prince Charles, who would become Charles II, reportedly collapsed upon receiving the news. Ambassadors across the continent went into mourning. Even those rulers who privately thought Charles had been a fool were terrified by the principle at stake. Because if England could execute a king, the logic did not stop at the English Channel. Back in London, the new regime moved quickly to remake the constitutional landscape. Within days of the execution, Parliament abolished the office of king, declaring monarchy itself unnecessary, burdensome, and dangerous. A week later, the House of Lords followed. The institution that had been a pillar of English governance since the Norman period was simply dissolved. England was declared a commonwealth, a republic governed by the Rump Parliament and a Council of State. Oliver Cromwell was its dominant military figure, but as yet held no singular office. Power was diffuse and uncertain, shared among men who agreed on what they had destroyed but disagreed sharply about what to build in its place. The body of Charles I was buried quietly at Windsor, without the traditional funeral rites, without ceremony, without the crown. A king interred like a common man. Yet something unexpected happened in the weeks that followed. A book appeared almost immediately, purportedly written by Charles himself during his imprisonment. Titled Icon Basilique, meaning the royal image, it depicted the king as a prayerful, suffering martyr. It sold tens of thousands of copies within the year. The man Parliament had killed was already becoming something more dangerous than a living opponent. He was becoming a legend. And legends, unlike kings, cannot be executed. England was now a republic. But what, exactly, did that mean? The men who governed the new Commonwealth had demolished a monarchy without agreeing on what should replace it. The Rump Parliament, that shrunken remnant of the original Long Parliament, purged by Colonel Pride in 1648, held legislative authority. A Council of State handled executive functions. And somewhere above both, in practical terms if not formal ones, stood Oliver Cromwell, commanding the most formidable army in English history. Power, in other words, was everywhere and nowhere simultaneously. The constitutional contradictions were glaring from the first day. A republic premised on parliamentary sovereignty was being run by a parliament that represented almost nobody, having expelled its opponents by military force. The army that had made the revolution possible now watched impatiently as civilian politicians debated endlessly without resolving the basic questions of how England should actually be governed. Elections that might have provided legitimacy were perpetually deferred, because everyone feared what a genuine popular vote might produce. Perhaps a royalist majority. Perhaps chaos. Nobody wanted to find out. Cromwell had no time for these theoretical tangles. He had wars to fight. Ireland came first. Since the rebellion of 1641, the island had descended into a complex and brutal conflict involving Irish Catholic Confederates, Protestant settlers, and royalist factions. Charles II, newly proclaimed king in exile, was assembling support wherever he could find it. Ireland could not be left as an open flank. In August of 1649, Cromwell landed at Dublin with an army of 12,000 men and began what would become one of history's most controversial military campaigns. The sieges of Drogheda and Wexford defined the campaign's character. At Drogheda, the garrison refused to surrender. Cromwell's forces breached the walls in September 1649 and slaughtered the defenders almost to a man. Perhaps 2,000 soldiers died. Clergy found sheltering in the town were killed alongside them. Cromwell wrote afterward that he considered the massacre an act of righteous judgment, a terror calculated to shorten the war and spare future bloodshed. Whether it was strategy or vengeance, the memory never faded. In Ireland, the name Cromwell carried a particular darkness for centuries to come. Scotland presented a different kind of threat. The Scots had proclaimed Charles II their king, swallowing their theological reservations in favor of political calculation. Cromwell marched north. At Dunbar in September 1650, outnumbered and seemingly cornered against the sea, his army shattered a Scottish force roughly twice its size. It was a victory so complete that Cromwell himself could barely believe it, writing that the Lord had delivered the enemy into his hands. Charles II attempted one last gamble. In 1651, he led a Scottish army deep into England itself, gambling that English royalists would rise to join him. They did not rise in any meaningful numbers. At Worcester on the 3rd of September, 1651, Cromwell's forces crushed the invasion so thoroughly that Charles spent 6 weeks hiding in trees and farmhouses before escaping to France. The royalist military threat, for now, was extinguished. What remained was the problem of the rump. By 1653, Cromwell's patience had run out entirely. The parliament that had executed a king and survived civil war had somehow failed to produce a workable constitution in 4 years of trying. On the 20th of April, 1653, Cromwell walked into the chamber with a file of soldiers and told the members to leave. He reportedly pointed at the mace on the table and called it a fool's bauble. Take it away. The Republic had devoured its own foundation. Something new would have to fill the void, and the only man with the authority to shape it was the general who had just cleared the room. The room was empty. The Republic's parliament was gone. And Oliver Cromwell, the farmer's son from Huntingdon who had never sought power, according to his own insistence, now found himself the only force holding England together. In December of 1653, a new constitutional document called the Instrument of Government formalized what everyone already understood. Cromwell became Lord Protector of England, Scotland, and Ireland. The title was deliberately chosen to avoid the word king, yet the substance of the office was unmistakably royal. He wore black instead of ermine. He lived in Whitehall Palace. He governed by decree. What kind of England would this protectorate build? Cromwell's answer was a godly one. The Puritans who surrounded him believed England had a covenant with God, and that covenant required righteous living. The theaters that had scandalized the godly for decades were shuttered. Alahouses faced strict regulation. Sunday became a day of enforced quiet, with constables empowered to turn back travelers who could not prove necessity. Most strikingly, Christmas was effectively abolished. The Puritan leadership considered it a pagan invention dressed in Christian clothing, and the feast days that ordinary English men and women had celebrated for generations were stripped away by parliamentary ordinance. The enforcement mechanism was blunt. In 1655, Cromwell divided England into 11 military districts, each governed by a major general drawn from the officer class of his new model army. These men were answerable directly to Cromwell, bypassing traditional local government entirely. They supervised morality, suppressed dissent, and collected a new decimation tax levied specifically on former royalists. For roughly 18 months, England lived under something that looked remarkably like military occupation, administered by men who combined martial authority with evangelical zeal. The nation endured it, but it did not embrace it. Even many who had opposed Charles I found the major generals intrusive and the Puritan program suffocating. When did godliness become tyranny? The question hung in the air. Cromwell himself was more complicated than his regime suggested. He extended a remarkable degree of tolerance toward Jews, readmitting them to England after nearly 4 centuries of formal exclusion. He protected Quakers and other dissenting Protestants from the harshest persecution. He was capable of genuine theological curiosity, even as his government imposed conformity on ordinary life. In 1657, Parliament offered him the crown. He deliberated for weeks, genuinely tempted. The offer was refused, but the fact that it was even considered revealed how completely the Republic had abandoned its own principles. By the summer of 1658, Cromwell was exhausted, grief-stricken after the death of his beloved daughter and visibly failing. He died on the 3rd of September 1658, the anniversary of his greatest victories. England exhaled. The godly experiment was over in all but name. Now came the desperate question of what would fill the silence he left behind. The silence Cromwell left behind was filled, briefly and unconvincingly, by his son. Richard Cromwell had not been forged in the fires of civil war. He was a country gentleman, amiable, and essentially harmless, who had spent the years of his father's greatness managing his estate in Hampshire. He had never commanded troops, never wrestled with theology, never made an enemy worth fearing. In September of 1658, this quietly pleasant man found himself Lord Protector of 3 nations. The army did not respect him. The Parliament he summoned did not trust him. Within 8 months, the officers who had carried his father's regime on their bayonets simply told Richard Cromwell to leave. He obliged, disappearing into obscurity so thoroughly that he would eventually outlive Charles II himself, dying peacefully in 1712 at the age of 85. History has remembered him mostly as Tumble-Down Dick, which is perhaps crueler than he deserved, but not inaccurate as a description of his government. What followed was something close to chaos. The Rump Parliament returned, was expelled again, and returned once more. Generals argued with politicians. London grew anxious. The question that had haunted England for nearly 2 decades was finally forcing itself to the surface. Without a king, who held authority? Who settled disputes? Who made the final decision when powerful men disagreed? The answer came marching south from Scotland in January of 1660. General George Monk commanded the English army stationed in Edinburgh, a professional soldier who had served both the king and the Republic with equal discipline and kept his own counsel throughout. He was not a man of obvious idealism. He was a man of order. And England, in the winter of 1660, desperately needed order. Monk crossed the border on the 1st of January and marched his well-disciplined troops the length of England without firing a shot. As he moved south, his intentions remained studiously unclear. Politicians flattered him. Royalist agents courted him. He said very little. But when he reached London in February, his actions spoke plainly. He compelled the recall of the full Parliament that had been purged back in 1648, filling the Commons with the moderate Presbyterian members who had been excluded for over a decade. That Parliament had only one realistic purpose, and everyone understood it. Negotiations opened with the young man living in exile on the continent. Charles Stewart had spent 12 years wandering between the courts of Europe, dependent on the charity of foreign monarchs, sustained by hope and very little else. He was 30 years old now, dark, sardonic, and patient. From the Dutch city of Breda in April of 1660, Charles issued a declaration of striking political wisdom. He promised a general pardon for those who had opposed his family. He promised religious toleration. He promised to leave difficult questions of property and settlement to Parliament. He offered reconciliation without demanding humiliation. It was, in effect, a promise to forget the last 20 years. Parliament accepted. The invitation went out. And on the 29th of May, 1660, his 30th birthday, Charles II rode into London through streets lined with cheering crowds, flowers scattered in his path, church bells ringing across the city. The Republic was finished. The experiment was over. The reckoning, however, was not. Within months, the body of Oliver Cromwell was dug from its grave in Westminster Abbey, dragged to Tyburn, the traditional site of criminal executions, and hanged in its rotting shroud. The skull was mounted on a spike above Westminster Hall, where it remained for more than 20 years, a warning to anyone who might again contemplate killing a king. The Stuarts were back. Now they had to prove they had learned something from their years in the wilderness. Charles II had made generous promises from Breda. The reality of governing proved considerably messier. The Restoration settlement offered pardon to almost everyone who had fought against the crown, with one conspicuous exception. The men who had signed his father's death warrant, the regicides, faced justice. 12 were executed. Others fled into exile. It was selective vengeance, calibrated rather than hysterical, which said something important about the new king's temperament. Charles understood that a nation cannot be ruled by permanent score settling. What he could not control entirely was Parliament. The so-called Cavalier Parliament, elected in 1661 and dominated by royalist Anglicans hungry for revenge, proved more vindictive than the king himself. Between 1661 and 1665, it passed a series of laws known collectively as the Clarendon Code, named after Charles's chief minister Edward Hyde, the Earl of Clarendon. These acts systematically excluded religious nonconformists, Presbyterians, Quakers, Baptists from public office, from universities, from preaching within 5 miles of any town. The toleration Charles had promised at Breda quietly evaporated, not because the king willed it, but because he lacked the political power to prevent it. Yet it would be a mistake to dwell only on these tensions when describing a reign that felt in its early years like sunlight breaking through cloud. England had been gray for too long. The theaters, closed since 1642 by Puritan decree, reopened. Women appeared on stage for the first time in English theatrical history. Samuel Pepys recorded everything in his extraordinary diary, the gossip, the plays, the food, the fashions, with the breathless enthusiasm of a man rediscovering pleasure after a long fast. The king himself set the tone. Charles was tall, dark, and magnetic, a man who wore his intelligence lightly and his charm effortlessly. He moved through his court like a man who found human nature endlessly amusing rather than endlessly disappointing. He kept mistresses openly, Barbara Villiers being the most notorious and tempestuous of the early years, and fathered at least 14 illegitimate children. He acknowledged them all, showering them with titles. What he conspicuously failed to produce was a legitimate heir. This was not merely a personal matter. His Queen Catherine of Braganza, whom he married in 1662, was Catholic. His brother James, next in the line of succession, was drifting toward Rome. England, a Protestant nation still raw from religious conflict, watched these developments with growing unease. There was, amid all this, genuine intellectual brilliance. In 1660, Charles granted a royal charter to a group of natural philosophers who met weekly to conduct experiments and share observations. The Royal Society would become one of the most consequential scientific institutions in history, counting figures like Robert Boyle and Christopher Wren among its early members. The merry monarch presided over a nation healing itself, imperfectly and unevenly. But beneath the laughter and the lamplight, older pressures were building. They would not stay quiet for long. London in the summer of 1665 was a city of closed doors and burning prayers. The plague had arrived quietly, as it always did, carried through the port districts of Giles and Stepney before the authorities fully grasped what was happening. By June, the bills of mortality, the weekly tallies of the dead, were climbing at a rate that silenced even hardened city dwellers. By September, over 7,000 Londoners were dying in a single week. Before the epidemic burned itself out, nearly 100,000 people had perished, roughly a quarter of the city's entire population. The wealthy fled first. Charles II and his court retreated to Oxford, where Parliament briefly convened at the university's halls. Samuel Pepys, still faithfully keeping his diary, watched his neighbors pack their belongings and stream out of the city. Those who could not afford to leave stayed behind with the rats, the red crosses painted on infected doorways, and the carts that rumbled through emptied streets before dawn. What kind of city abandons its people? The question hung in the smoky air over London that terrible summer. Physicians who remained often worked in terror, wearing beak-shaped masks filled with herbs, believing the disease traveled through foul air. They were wrong about the mechanism, but correct about the danger. Thousands of them died alongside their patients. Then, before London had time to grieve properly, came the fire. It began before dawn on the 2nd of September 1666 at a bakery on Pudding Lane near London Bridge. A spark, an unattended oven, a city built almost entirely of timber after centuries of cheap construction. The summer had been brutally dry. The fire found everything it touched to be perfect fuel. For 4 days it burned. The diarist John Evelyn described standing on the south bank of the Thames watching the entire northern skyline consumed in a continuous roar of flame, the lead of church roofs melting and flowing through the streets, the stones of St. Paul's Cathedral exploding in the heat. 13,200 houses vanished. 87 churches. The medieval city that had survived plague and invasion for centuries was simply gone. When the smoke finally cleared, the search for blame began almost immediately. A monument was erected near the fire's origin, and its inscription, added later, accused Catholics of deliberate arson. A confused French watchmaker named Robert Hubert confessed to starting the blaze and was hanged, even though evidence suggested he had not even arrived in England until after the fire began. The conspiracy theory said more about England's anxieties than about any actual conspiracy. The ruins, however, offered something extraordinary. A blank canvas in the heart of one of Europe's great cities. Christopher Wren, already a celebrated member of the Royal Society, submitted his redesign of London within days of the fire's end. His grand vision of wide boulevards and rational planning was never fully realized. London's property owners rebuilt too quickly and too jealously for that. But Wren did reshape the city's skyline permanently. He designed 52 new churches to replace those destroyed. And at the center of everything, rising over 3 decades of painstaking construction, came the new St. Paul's Cathedral, its great dome becoming the symbol of a city that had survived the unthinkable. 2 catastrophes in 2 years had shaken London to its foundations. Yet the city that emerged from the ash and silence was younger, cleaner, and in some ways more modern than anything that had stood before. A Stuart dynasty that had already survived exile and civil war was about to face a different kind of reckoning, one that came not from fire or disease, but from parliament, religion, and the gathering storm over the succession. The conspiracy that nearly tore England apart began with one man's extraordinary talent for lying. Titus Oates was a failed clergyman, a serial fraudster, and a man of almost limitless audacity. In the autumn of 1678, he appeared before the Privy Council with an elaborate tale of a vast Catholic plot to assassinate Charles II, place his Catholic brother James on the throne, and return England to Rome by force. Almost every word was fabricated. None of that mattered. England was primed to believe him. Decades of suspicion toward Catholics, memories of the Gunpowder Plot, and fresh anxieties about Catholic France under Louis XIV had created an atmosphere where fear needed only a spark. Oates provided an inferno. When a magistrate named Sir Edmund Barry Godfrey, who had taken Oates's initial depositions, was found dead on Primrose Hill in October, apparently murdered, the panic became ungovernable. Parliament erupted. London's streets filled with anti-Catholic demonstrations. The judicial machinery of the state, which should have protected the innocent, instead began grinding them to pieces. Over the following 3 years, at least 22 men were executed on the basis of Oates's testimony, virtually all of them innocent. Jesuits, priests, and ordinary Catholic gentlemen went to the gallows while crowds cheered and Oates collected rewards. It was one of the most shameful episodes in English legal history. But behind the hysteria lay a genuine constitutional battle. Parliamentary leaders, particularly the Earl of Shaftesbury, seized the moment. If Catholics were so dangerous, how could England tolerate a Catholic heir to the throne? 3 times between 1679 and 1681, exclusion bills were introduced in Parliament, each designed to bar James, Duke of York, from inheriting the crown. The crisis forced England's political nation to choose sides, and in choosing, it invented modern party politics. Those who supported exclusion were labeled Whigs, a term originally used as an insult for Scottish Presbyterian rebels. Those who defended the hereditary succession and the crown's prerogative were labeled Tories, equally an insult, drawn from Irish Catholic outlaw terminology. Both names stuck. The world's oldest surviving political party identities were born from a manufactured panic. Charles II, so often underestimated, proved himself a shrewder politician than any of them. He dissolved Parliament, called fresh elections, shifted venues, and ultimately broke the exclusion movement entirely by ruling without Parliament in his final years, sustained by subsidies from Louis XIV. His opponents had overplayed their hand. When Charles died in February 1685, he received last rites from a Catholic priest, fulfilling suspicions that had followed him for decades. His deathbed conversion surprised almost no one who had watched him carefully. The crown passed peacefully to James, Duke of York. The exclusionists had failed. But the questions they had raised about Catholic monarchy and parliamentary power were far from settled. James II walked to his throne in February 1685 with something genuinely unexpected on his side: goodwill. The exclusion crisis had exhausted England. After years of manufactured panic and bitter parliamentary warfare, many of his subjects were simply relieved to see the succession pass without bloodshed. Even some Whigs held their breath and hoped. That fragile goodwill was tested almost immediately. James Scott, the Duke of Monmouth, was Charles II's eldest illegitimate son, handsome and popular, the Protestant champion the exclusionists had dreamed of placing on the throne. In June 1685, Monmouth landed in southwest England with a small force and raised his standard at Lyme Regis. Thousands of ordinary Protestant tradesmen and farmers rallied to him, armed with scythes and pitchforks and desperate hope. It ended in a single night. At the Battle of Sedgemoor on July the 6th, royal forces destroyed Monmouth's amateur army in the darkness of the Somerset marshes. Monmouth himself was found hiding in a ditch, disguised as a shepherd. He was beheaded on Tower Hill, the executioner requiring 5 blows to complete the work. Then came the reckoning. Judge George Jeffreys swept through the western counties in what became known as the Bloody Assizes, trying the survivors with a ferocity that shocked even a hardened age. 320 men were executed. Hundreds more were transported to the Caribbean as bonded laborers. Jeffreys earned his nickname, the Hanging Judge, and James earned a warning he refused to read. He had survived his first challenge. He mistook survival for invincibility. What followed was a systematic campaign to dismantle the Protestant establishment that had governed England for a century. James used his royal prerogative to suspend laws against Catholics and Protestant dissenters alike, issuing his Declaration of Indulgence in 1687 and demanding it be read from every pulpit in England. 7 bishops, including the Archbishop of Canterbury himself, refused and petitioned the king to reconsider. James had them arrested and tried for seditious libel. The trial of the 7 bishops in June 1688 became a national drama. When the jury returned a verdict of not guilty, London erupted. Crowds lit bonfires. Soldiers in the royal camp were heard cheering. James stood at his window and watched his kingdom celebrate his humiliation. He might still have survived even this because his reign had an obvious end. James was 54 years old. His Protestant daughters, Mary and Anne, stood next in line. England could wait him out. And then on June the 10th, 1688, his Catholic queen gave birth to a healthy son. The calculation changed overnight. A Catholic male heir meant not years of James, but generations. The bonfires that should have celebrated a royal birth stayed dark and cold. Rumors spread instantly that the baby was a changeling, smuggled into the birthing chamber in a warming pan to manufacture a Catholic succession. The rumors were almost certainly false. The desperation behind them was entirely real. Within weeks, 7 prominent Englishmen, Whig lords and Tory bishops together, men who had spent their careers as political enemies, signed a secret letter and sent it across the North Sea to William of Orange, husband of James's Protestant daughter Mary. They invited him to bring an army. They promised he would be welcomed. England had decided. The question now was whether William would come and what would happen when he did. 21. The Glorious Revolution 1688. 1689, he came on the 5th of November, 1688. The date was not accidental. William of Orange landed at Torbay on the southwest coast of England with roughly 14,000 soldiers, the largest invasion force to touch English soil since the Norman conquest. His fleet of almost 500 ships had sailed down the channel in full view of the English coast, flags flying, drums beating, a brass band playing on the deck of his flagship. It was a spectacle designed to be seen, and England saw it. William brought with him a printed declaration, copied and distributed by the thousands, announcing that he came not to conquer but to rescue English liberties from a tyrannical king. Whether anyone fully believed him hardly mattered. He had soldiers. James did not have enough men willing to use theirs. What followed was less a battle than a slow collapse. James assembled his army on Salisbury Plain, but the defections began almost before the armies could meet. John Churchill, the most gifted military commander in England, the man James had personally raised to prominence, rode out of the royal camp on the night of November 23rd and joined William's side. Princess Anne, James's own daughter, slipped away from her London apartments and fled north to join the rebellion. James suffered a series of severe nosebleeds at Salisbury, so heavy they left him weakened and unable to command. Some historians have speculated about the cause. Others suggest the explanation was simpler. The body sometimes knows what the mind cannot yet admit. He returned to London and tried to negotiate. William kept advancing. By December, it was clear that no negotiation would save him. On the night of December 10th, James threw the Great Seal of England into the Thames, hoping to make orderly government impossible, and attempted to flee to France. He was caught by fishermen in Kent, humiliated, and brought back to London. William, remarkably, let him go. A dead king would be a martyr. An escaped king was simply an absence. James crossed the Channel on December 23rd and never returned. The flight to France became known as his abdication, though James himself never accepted that description for the rest of his life. England exhaled. The thing had been done, and remarkably little blood had been spilled. Not on English soil, anyway. The Irish and the Scottish reckonings would come later, and they would be brutal by any measure. But first came the constitutional settlement. A convention parliament assembled in January 1689, faced with a question no one had quite answered yet: what exactly had just happened, and who now ruled? After weeks of careful, sometimes furious debate, Parliament declared that James had abdicated by his flight and offered the throne jointly to William and Mary as co-sovereigns. Mary was the legitimate Stuart heir. William was the man with the army. Both were necessary. The offer came attached to a document. The Bill of Rights, passed in December 1689, transformed what might have been merely a change of monarch into something genuinely revolutionary. It abolished the royal prerogative to suspend laws. It guaranteed freedom of speech within Parliament. It required regular parliamentary elections. It banned the maintenance of a standing army in peacetime without parliamentary consent. Every power James had exercised to dismantle the Protestant establishment was specifically, carefully, permanently removed. The English called it the Glorious Revolution, and the name stuck. It was glorious in the sense that it was swift, that the constitutional gains were real and lasting, that it produced no guillotine and no public execution of a king. The Bill of Rights stands as a direct ancestor of constitutional democracy. Its principles echoed across the centuries in documents that would shape nations not yet imagined in 1689. But William's war was not finished. Across the Irish Sea, James would land again with French support. In the Scottish Highlands, Jacobite claymores were already being sharpened. The revolution that felt so bloodless in London was about to demand a very different kind of payment elsewhere. James landed at Kinsale in March 1689, welcomed by cheering crowds and the support of the Irish Catholic majority who saw in his cause their own. With French money, French officers, and an Irish army swelling toward perhaps 100,000 men, he moved north toward Ulster, where the Protestant population had barricaded itself inside the walled city of Derry. The siege of Derry lasted 105 days. Inside the walls, roughly 30,000 civilians and defenders starved, waiting for relief ships that Parliament had promised and the English Navy seemed reluctant to send. Thousands died of disease and hunger. The defenders famously refused every demand to surrender, their cry of "no surrender" becoming a rallying phrase that echoes in Northern Ireland to this day. When relief ships finally broke through the boom across the River Foyle in July 1689, the siege collapsed. It was James's first serious reversal, and it would not be his last. A year later, William himself crossed to Ireland. The two kings faced each other on the banks of the River Boyne on the 1st of July, 1690. William's army, nearly 36,000 strong and containing Dutch, Danish, French Huguenot, and English regiments, crossed the river against a Jacobite force of perhaps 25,000. The battle was hard fought but decisive. James, watching his lines break, left the field and rode to Dublin, then sailed for France. His Irish supporters never forgave what they called his swift departure. They called him Seamus and Chaka, a Gaelic epithet too impolite for polite translation. The fighting continued for another year, ending with the Treaty of Limerick in October 1691. The terms were not dishonorable, but the Protestant-dominated Irish Parliament refused to honor them fully. Tens of thousands of Catholic Irish soldiers, the men who would become known as the Wild Geese, sailed to France rather than submit. They would fight under European flags for generations, their descendants filling the officer corps of armies across the continent. In Scotland, the revolution had sparked its own fierce resistance. John Graham of Claverhouse, Viscount Dundee, raised the Highland clans for James and won a stunning victory at the Pass of Killiecrankie in July 1689, routing a government force through a screaming Highland charge. But Dundee died in the moment of his victory, shot through a gap in his armor, and without his leadership, the rising eventually faded. What followed was more calculated and more shameful. In February 1692, government soldiers who had been billeted as guests among the MacDonald clan of Glencoe turned on their hosts in the pre-dawn darkness and massacred 38 men, women, and children. The order had come from Edinburgh, ultimately sanctioned by William himself. It was not the largest atrocity of the era, but it was the betrayal of hospitality that made it unforgivable to Highland memory. The Jacobite cause was not finished. It had merely retreated, waiting for the next generation to take it up. William III had secured the throne, but he had also, almost without intending it, secured something larger. The Glorious Revolution had established a principle that no English monarch could safely ignore. Parliament governed. The Bill of Rights of 1689, the Toleration Act, the Triennial Act requiring regular elections, and finally the Act of Settlement of 1701 which barred Catholics from the succession entirely, these were not mere legislation. They were the architecture of a new constitutional order. By the time William died after a riding accident in March 1702, the crown had become something a monarch wore rather than wielded. The woman who inherited it was, in almost every personal sense, a figure of tragedy. Queen Anne was 37 years old at her accession, already ravaged by gout and by grief. She had been pregnant 17 times. Not one of her children survived to adulthood. Her son William, Duke of Gloucester, the brightest hope of the Protestant succession, had died at 11 years old in 1700. Anne would reign over a growing empire while presiding over a family that had simply ceased to exist. Yet her reign produced one of the most consequential decades in British history. The War of the Spanish Succession, which had begun under William against the ambitions of Louis XIV of France, now found its greatest champion in John Churchill, the Duke of Marlborough. Churchill was a commander of extraordinary gifts. At Blenheim in 1704, at Ramillies in 1706, at Oudenarde and Malplaquet, his armies shattered French forces that had seemed invincible. For a brief period, England's military prestige on the European continent reached heights it had never previously known. The nation that had so recently been racked by civil war and revolution was winning battles that reshaped the map of Europe. And then came 1707. The Act of Union between England and Scotland had been debated, resisted, bribed through, and finally achieved. Scotland's parliament voted itself out of existence in exchange for guaranteed Presbyterian church governance, free trade within the new union, and representation at Westminster. English merchants gained access to Scottish ports and Scotland's colonial ambitions. Many Scots were furious. The poet Robert Burns would later call it a parliament bought and sold for English gold. But the Kingdom of Great Britain now existed, and the Saltire of Scotland was joined to the Cross of St. George on a new flag that would eventually become among the most recognizable symbols on earth. Anne's final years were shadowed by political warfare between Tories and Whigs, by her estrangement from the formidable Duchess of Marlborough, and by the exhausting peace negotiations that eventually produced the Treaty of Utrecht in 1713. She was ill, she was isolated, and the question of her successor hung over every conversation in every court in Europe. The Act of Settlement meant the crown must pass to a Protestant. The nearest Protestant heir was George of Hanover, a German prince who spoke almost no English and had never set foot in Britain. On the 1st of August, 1714, Queen Anne died. She was 49 years old. With her, the Stuart Dynasty's direct hold on the British throne ended. A line that had begun with James VI of Scotland riding south to claim Elizabeth's crown now concluded with a woman dying alone, her body so swollen by illness that her coffin was said to be almost square. The Stuarts were gone from the throne. But they were not gone from history. A pretender waded across the water, and those who still believed in the Stuart cause were already sharpening something more dangerous than arguments. They called it the 15 and the 45, shorthand for two last desperate attempts to put a Stuart back on the British throne. The first came barely a year after Anne's death when James Francis Edward Stuart, the son of the deposed James II, landed in Scotland with French support and the hopes of thousands of Highland clans burning behind him. The rising of 1715 was poorly coordinated and quickly crushed. James himself arrived too late, too hesitant, too cold in manner to inspire the fire his cause required. He retreated to the continent and would spend the rest of his life in exile, a king only in the prayers of those who still called him James III. 30 years passed. Then his son tried again. Charles Edward Stuart, Bonnie Prince Charlie, was everything his father was not. Charismatic, reckless, and luminously young, he landed in Scotland in 1745 with barely a handful of men and talked an entire Highland army into following him south. He took Edinburgh. He won at Prestonpans. He marched into England as far as Derby, close enough to London that King George II was reportedly packing his bags. And then, fatally, he turned back. On the 16th of April, 1746, the dream ended on a moorland called Culloden, east of Inverness. In under an hour, government artillery shredded the Highland charge. Over 1,000 Jacobites died on the field. The reprisals that followed were savage and systematic. The clan system was dismantled. The wearing of tartan was banned. The Highlands were pacified with a brutality that transformed Gaelic Scotland forever. Bonnie Prince Charlie escaped to the continent and drank himself slowly to death in Rome. The Stuart cause died with him in 1788. But here is the great paradox that the whole Stuart story illuminates. The dynasty had spent a century trying to expand royal power, to govern without interference, to rule by divine right. They had failed completely. And in failing, they had accidentally constructed something that would change the world. The constitutional settlement that emerged from the Stuart struggles gave Britain parliamentary sovereignty, a limited monarchy, a protected judiciary, and a tradition of lawful opposition. The party politics born from Whig and Tory battles in the 1680s became the template for representative democracy across the globe. The free press that flourished after the lapsing of the Licensing Act in 1695 made public debate a permanent feature of British life. The Stuarts wanted to be absolute monarchs. They became instead the unwilling architects of modern democracy. Every parliament that sits today, every constitutional monarchy, every Bill of Rights, and every liberal democracy carries something of that long argument between a dynasty and its people. It is one of history's finest ironies. The family that tried hardest to stop the future ended up, perhaps more than any other, making it. The Stuarts failed at everything they intended, yet built everything that endured. Subscribe for more stories of dynasties, revolutions, and the accidental architects of our world.